Hello, I'm Shane Healy, the Director of Media and Communications for the Catholic Archdiocese of Melbourne, and I'm very delighted to be joined today by Patricia Faulkner. Patricia has worn many hats, but her most recent was as a Deputy Commissioner for the Royal Commission into Family Violence, which was just very recently released. So Patricia, thanks for your time. It's great to have a chat. Could we maybe start with right now, domestic violence, family violence? What's your overview of where it's at right now, 2016?
In 2016, family violence has received recognition, so it's become a conversation in the community, which is progress compared to the times when it was hidden. So the work of Christine Nixon and Rosie Batty have allowed people to come forward and talk about it, but the response that people get when they come forward is not as helpful as it could be. In fact, it's very difficult once you come forward to get the assistance that you need. So
was that borne out in the enormous work you all did? If you don't mind me just grabbing a hold of the, this is the summary of the report. I'm told it's about 7,000 pages?
7 kilos.
Oh, 7 kilos, yes. Wow. But picking up on your point there, were you finding as you talked to people that that was a recurring theme, that they just weren't being heard?
Yes, we had extensive consultations across Victoria and a lot of evidence given in our hearings from women who felt they weren't believed, for one thing. That was a very important point, and that when they sought help, they often couldn't get the sort of assistance they needed. And the assistance is very broad, Shane. It's things like housing. If you are leaving a violent relationship, there isn't an easy place for you to go. The number of refuges are very limited, and then when you go to a refuge, they're quite unsuitable. And as well as that, when you need housing beyond that, you usually have to leave your community to get away from a violent partner.
So as you're talking about it now in 2016, and they're just unbelievable things, even that small number of things you've already said, has it changed much in 20 years? Has it changed much in a generation?
It's changed only from the point of view of a police and justice response has been strengthened. So there's been a lot of work done in the police force on trying to change the culture there so that the police respond more rapidly. We were told during the Royal Commission that up to 40 to 60% of police work is now in domestic violence.
Gee.
And that's a massive amount and a massive change. And there's been a cultural change in police that is still a work in progress. There are still women, particularly, who would complain about the treatment they get, the variable nature. Some policemen are really good and others are not as attentive and often dismiss the complaint that's being made.
I think it'll be fresh in everybody's mind, the horrific murder that just occurred in Mildura.
Yes.
Is that typical or atypical of that whole world of domestic violence you've been looking at?
It is the tip of the iceberg. We have at least one woman killed in Australia every week at the hands of their partner. So the death rate is very high. It is in fact the major cause of premature death of women in Australia. However, there is a lot of other violence that doesn't get the same notoriety. The emotional abuse that occurs, the financial abuse that occurs of elders, so children who are often drug takers, abusing their parents, taking their money, taking their assets from them. So there's lots of forms of family violence that aren't as easily recognised and aren't as easily dealt with. And there are groups in the community that get very little assistance, so people from same-sex relationships, people from different ethnic backgrounds also find that the services that are available, they're seen as invisibles in those services.
Okay. So I suppose there's a pretty obvious answer to this, and I'm suspecting it's no, and that is, are we winning? Are we making some progress?
Yes, I have to say that we are making some progress because of the factor that people are talking about it, that a person like Rosie Batty raised awareness, and that the question of gender inequity and its relationship to violence is much more recognised than it was in the past. So worldwide, the greatest predictor of the level of violence is how inequitable the relationships between men and women are.
Yep.
And so we've had that sort of issue about how well are we doing with respecting a role for women in our society. And that, funnily enough, is the thing that if you change that, you will change the level of violence in our community.
So I'm talking to Patricia Faulkner, Deputy Commissioner for the recent Royal Commission into Family Violence and Domestic Violence. A question around the findings themselves, without having to go into too great a detail. What would you summarise as the important and major findings of the report?
One of the major findings is that it's very difficult for women to know where to go to get help. And so one of the recommendations is to try and build these hubs in the community, which will be a very recognisable point where you can go to get assistance. Another major finding is that the response is quite late. So the response is focused around police and courts, and it's certainly calling on governments and the community in general to intervene earlier, so that you as a citizen is being asked to stand up and oppose violence against women.
Right.
So sporting clubs, businesses, all having a knowledge of what happens, the dynamics of family violence, and being able to stand up and say to your mate, it's not on. As well as that, schools are being called upon to develop much more in terms of respectful relationships courses. Now, I know a lot of people will say, why can't families do that? It appears they can't. So schools are being asked to develop a curriculum that deals with respectful relationships right from the beginning of school. And it won't be talking about family violence at that stage, it'll just be talking about how to deal with conflict. And as you go through to the secondary schools, it'll be dealing with a whole range of issues like developing sexual relationships between men and women, what's appropriate, the use of pornography, a whole range of things that help you form a view about what is an appropriate relationship managed without violence. So one of the very important recommendations is to intervene earlier.
Right.
And there are well-known points where domestic violence escalates, and one of those is at the birth of the first child in a relationship.
That's interesting.
Yep. And so we're asking a much broader range of people. So at the moment, maternal and child health nurses are trained to try and ask questions about whether domestic violence is present, as well as dealing with the issues of how well is the child sleeping, how well is it feeding, is it gaining weight. So there's a whole move to move forward in terms of the cycle and dynamics of violence, to intervene earlier and to call upon everybody to play their part. It's not just a role for law enforcement, it's a role for everyone in the community.
And the process that you just began to explain, is that up and running, or are these still simply recommendations? There
are pockets of good practice that we called upon in making our recommendations. We heard from people in hospitals who are experimenting with having an element of their pre-birth classes talking about violence.
Okay.
There are certainly maternal and child health nurses that after the birth of a child are dealing with violence. There are some counselling around having your first child, but it's pockets rather than something that is consistently available, and it's quite hard to find. So making it much more ubiquitous and able to be accessed will be one of the challenges that will be faced by our community in dealing with this.
And the state budget's been positive?
The state budget was extremely positive. Daniel Andrews has in fact agreed to implement all the recommendations. There are 227.
Excellent.
And he has made a start with the most pressing ones in this first budget. I think the figure is around 670 million extra dollars that have gone into the budget for this year.
Well, there's no lip service there. That's actually marvellous.
That's substantial money.
One more question, because we're almost out of time, is get your crystal ball out as best you can. 10 years down the track, or maybe 5 even. What would be your hope?
Well, it's a long-term project, changing attitudes. Again, I'm a woman that started in the workforce in the 70s, and it's now 2017, and attitudes towards women have changed extraordinarily slowly. So I would think that it will take at least a generation. So 5 years, you might see some better, earlier services, better education happening, you know, talking to boys particularly, because most of the violence is perpetrated by men against women, and certainly where it is perpetrated by men, it's also more severe than that's perpetrated against men. To trying to have an open discussion with boys and young men about what are appropriate attitudes to women. We might see that have started. We certainly hope we'll see an easier place for women to go to get assistance and more appropriate services for them. So easier to keep them in their own community. One of the big bugbears is that if a woman experiences violence, her major solution is to get out of the area. So she has to disrupt all the relationships she have that is supportive to her. She has to take her children out of school and put them in new schools. So we would hope that it turns around, that the perpetrator leaves the home and that there's enough protection of the woman to stay in her own place.
And be able to remain settled.
And to remain settled, particularly her family.
Yeah.
We'd hope also to see that children get a lot more support. So in this equation where there's violence happening at the home, there's a lot of focus on the man and the woman, and often children who are observing this violence are being damaged extraordinarily. And so we certainly made recommendations about better services for children who are experiencing violence. So I hope some of those would be on the ground, Shane, at that stage. And then there's a lot in terms of police and courts about just having better, more specialised workforces in the courts and in the police that can deal with when it gets to the stage that it needs law enforcement.
Well, Patricia Faulkner, a marvellous discussion. Thank you. Thank you for the great work you and your co-commissioners have done on this. It's received very positive feedback, unsurprisingly, particularly hearing you talk about it today. So thank you for your time.
It's fine, Shane. Thank you.